This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Early voting starts next week across Connecticut. People can vote early from Monday, October 21st through Sunday, November 3rd. This means voters can cast their ballots ahead of Election Day in November. Each town and city will have at least one early voting location, and voters can even cast their ballots over the weekend. You can find your voting location by visiting myvote.ct.gov. Today, we'll hear from two poll workers getting ready for early voting in Connecticut. Plus, we'll hear about what early voting looks like across the country. But first, ahead of this hour, we spoke to Connecticut Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, about the rollout of early voting in our state. And here's our conversation. Secretary Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here.
And so early voting, I think, is very top of mind for many of us. It's been in the news, and it's now available in Connecticut. What do you want our listeners to know about casting their ballots ahead of Election Day?
First and foremost, I want Connecticut voters to know that we have early voting. So many people watch the national news, and they haven't really paid attention to what the law is here in Connecticut, but I'm very pleased. This is the first election where all eligible voters can use early voting in Connecticut, and it will last 14 days.
And I mean, you sort of answered the question here, but I want to talk about eligibility. So is this anyone who is registered to vote or is going to register to vote are eligible to do early voting?
That's exactly right. A lot of people get confused. They think either something has changed about Election Day, but Election Day remains exactly the same. And early voting is just another in-person option. So there'll be one early voting location in every town. You can get it on your town's website. It's usually town hall. And any eligible voter, so you can either register during early voting or up until this coming Friday, or if you're already registered, you can just show up. You don't have to make any special arrangements, and the polling location will be ready for you.
And I believe it was during the primary that we've had early voting. Have there been any lessons learned from those primaries, and are they informing preparations for the general election?
Yeah, absolutely. We first used early voting for the presidential preference primary in late March and early April, and we learned a lot because that was the first time. And then we used it again in August. And the biggest lesson learned was that, one, we can do this. We didn't have any problems. And the couple of logistic issues we had to do with, what's the period of time before the check-in computer logs out for lack of activity,
Sure.
little logistic things like that. So our registrars of voters learned a lot about what type of staffing level might be necessary in a presidential election. And it helped us figure out what voters were confused about. You notice I mentioned that it's in-person voting. We learned that many people were thinking it was mail-in voting.
Got it. And I mean, speaking of logistics too, I think it's just a slight, there's a little difference between the general election going in person versus early voting. How do registrars and poll workers sort of secure ballots at early voting stations? Will there be tabulators there? Does it look different?
Sure. It's very similar to anyone who has voted in person in the past. One of the main differences I just mentioned, it's a different location. Do not go to your usual polling place. Early voting is only happening in one location per town. And one town has two locations, but you can look that up. But once you show up, you'll be checked in as usual. You'll receive your ballot as usual. But what's different, you'll also receive an envelope. And once you vote, you'll be putting the ballot in that envelope, sealing it, and then putting that in the secure receptacle. And the reason it's happening that way is that those ballots will not be opened until Election Day and counted, much like absentee ballots are not opened until Election Day. So I'm just excited. I hope many people decide to try it. Some people have said, we don't know what to expect, but now you know.
Yeah, it's funny because when we were discussing the latest trends in voting, it never really occurred to me to actually go and do it. So I may be one of the earlier voters this year, and we'll see what happens.
I
And
will say one political candidate laughingly told me that when she's out door knocking, she's been telling voters, like, hey, early voting is a great way to stop getting all of those last minute phone calls, text messages, and people knocking on your door, because once you voted, you're crossed off, so people don't need to double back to you. So I throw that out there in case anyone's
oh, hey,
interested.
that's a very nice tip, actually. and and like you mentioned a little bit earlier, I think elections voting, it's already a very big undertaking for cities and poll workers, and with early voting now, instead of one day, which is election day, some polling locations will now be open for 2 weeks in order to accommodate early voting. So can you talk about how is your office preparing and supporting town registrars and poll workers to do that?
Sure. Our biggest concern was that, as you say, every town across Connecticut will now have 14 additional days from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And two of those days are from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's a lot of additional manpower. So we thought there might be a shortage. So starting in the middle of last year, we put up an interest form on our website, collecting a lot more information than usual, such as how far are you willing to travel to be a poll worker? Have you ever done it before? And a lot of questions that would help registrars match potential poll workers to their town. And I'm happy to say this year alone, over 2,800 people filled out that interest form. And as of yesterday, we haven't heard of any towns that have a shortage. So I'm really grateful for all the work the registrars have done to recruit, train all the poll workers, but it looks like we're in good shape.
Well, it's really great to hear the enthusiasm. It's not something you hear often, right? When it
Yeah,
comes
yeah,
to
no,
elections.
absolutely. And we certainly spoke about it a lot. We have a lot of partnerships that we've built, especially with entities like the Connecticut Bar Association, and they have a civics committee, which people may not realize. So that was a natural source. They were very happy to reach out to many of their attorneys to see if they wanted to be poll workers. Also, with Veterans Affairs, the Realtors, many groups in Connecticut have been looking for a way to get more involved. So this is just one of those ways.
Well, and over the course of the year, when we talk about voting and have conversations with poll workers or longtime volunteers who've been working the polling station for many years, some have expressed concern just because in recent years they've experienced more intimidation or harassment or abuse against poll workers. Is your office doing any preparations to guard against any of that possibilities? Against any voter intimidation at the polls and harassment and abuse against poll workers?
Yeah, it's a big issue. Many of the people I've spoken with have indicated that they have certainly dealt with rudeness. But what's very interesting, based on, in part, the national news cycle, is the perception that something could happen.
Right.
And perception is reality. And we want people to continue to step up and serve our democracy in this way. So if they feel like it might not be safe, that is a deterrent. So we have been very intentional since last year. We have been meeting monthly with the Connecticut Fusion Center, which is made up of many security and law enforcement agencies, from the Department of Homeland Security that deals with elections, to FBI, our own emergency services and personal protection agency, state police, and on and on and on. And we spend every month talking about potential threats, building resilience among election workers and making sure they all have the tools and the know-how to deal with any situation. At the conference in September for both registrars and town clerks, for example, CISA, which is the Homeland Security Division that works on cybersecurity and elections, they did a training, a de-escalation training, and the FBI came to join in and offer some tips as well. So I think everyone in the election community is working together in a beautiful way to make sure that election workers are protected.
And talking about protection in a different way, I think this idea of voter fraud has really sort of come to the front of our attention over the last couple of years as well. And I have a sort of a twofold question here is how do town registrars and the Secretary of the State's office make sure that people don't vote twice, both as early voters and on election day? And is that something that you've seen actually happen?
No, I've certainly not seen or heard of that happening ever in Connecticut, really. But and it's funny, the timing of this question, it's a frustration of mine. I just received in my email about 2 minutes before we started this, an email about the type of fraud that is really taking not only the United States, but the world by storm. And that's fraud against business owners. People are co-opting businesses that haven't closed properly, or they're sending out what looks like government forms, charging a fee to file paperwork that is free. So that is a huge type of fraud, but no one's talking about it. Instead, we're talking about election fraud, which largely stems from claims that the presidential election, and ironically, every other election that year, apparently, the outcome was okay, but not the presidential election. So we've spent all of this time talking about fraud, but I just want to assure people that everyone in the election community before 2020 and since 2020, we have a number of procedures in place. Everyone is very serious in this field about protecting the integrity of elections. Our registrar manual, for example, here in Connecticut has about 200 pages worth of checks and balances and procedures that have to be followed to make sure that we are closing all the loopholes as possible. And our office certainly is working with the election staff on these things. I think every single voter in Connecticut should feel confident that their vote is being protected. And as you mentioned, much like if anyone's ever voted by absentee ballot, when town clerks receive those ballots, they log them into our central voter registration system. And if you showed up to vote on election day, when they look up your name, it'll have an A next to it. And that's how poll workers know that you already voted. The same will be true with early voting. So all of these things are designated in the database so that election workers can do some checks and balances.
And as we get closer to early voting and also election day, are there any top of mind things that you would like to remind our listeners to just be aware of or prepare for, and also a reminder of what's the deadline to register to vote?
Sure. I'll start with the last question first. The deadline to register is this coming Friday, October 18th. But if you miss that deadline, you can still do same day registration during any of the early voting days or also on election day. And you can see your town website for those details. We also have a voter guide on our website at myvote.ct.gov where you can see those details. In terms of a final message to voters, I would say, thank a poll worker when you see them. It has been a lot of work to get everyone trained in time for early voting. And also, just remember, if you see something, say something. There are hotlines set up. You can also find that on our website. You can contact your town's registrar, and all of us work together, the State Elections Enforcement Commission, the Secretary's office, and law enforcement to make sure that everything is investigated. So, and also don't forget to vote.
That's an important message. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Thomas, for being with us today and clarifying a lot of what to expect on early voting and Election Day.
Thank you for having me.
That was Connecticut Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas. And Connecticut is far from the only state to do early voting. In fact, other states like Georgia have already kicked off their early voting period. And for more on how Connecticut compares, we're joined by David Becker. He's the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which is a nonprofit that works with election officials to promote voter participation and ensure election integrity. David, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Catherine.
So, David, you were listening to what Secretary Thomas has to say. We'd love to have you respond to if there's anything that jumped out to you.
Well, she laid out the rules in Connecticut really well, and I think it's important to note Connecticut has now joined that vast majority of states that allow early in-person voting. In fact, it's not just the majority, it's 47 of the states, 97% of all voters will have access to early in-person voting in states that are deeply red and deeply blue and everything in between. The only states that still don't offer it are Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. So Connecticut has joined these states in offering this really important option for voters. And we should also note it's really a testament to the leadership of Secretary Thomas and her staff and all of the people across the state of Connecticut and the townships and the volunteer poll workers who've made this a reality. Voters in Connecticut are now going to experience what voters all over the rest of the country have experienced, which is not just the convenience of early voting, where you can pick and choose when exactly you want to go according to your schedule, but also the security of early voting. This is often something that's missed when people talk about it, because it's usually thought of just as something that's really convenient for voters, and it is. But it's also something that adds to the overall security of the process. Once you cast your ballot, if you choose to cast it early, you've inoculated yourself as a voter against disinformation, against efforts to cause you to doubt or impair your vote in some way. And also, it's a great early warning system against potential issues like disinformation from foreign adversaries and domestic actors. It's very rare, but if there's an attempted cyber attack, and also just ordinary everyday things that could impact voting, things like the weather, things like traffic, things like life events where you have to go pick your child up at school. So it's really important. If you vote early, you're part of the election integrity system. You're part of the early warning system. And every vote that's voted early means one fewer person that might show up in line on Election Day.
Well, I mean, just by you laying that out, it sounds like a great system to really start getting used to for those who, this may be a new thing to get into the habit of thinking. Are there any big differences or maybe similarities in terms of how states are doing early voting? Does it look different in different states?
It looks a little different in some states. The majority of states, when you go to vote early, you go to an early voting site. And like in Connecticut, these are larger sites. There are fewer of them, but you can generally vote. In Connecticut, it's by township. In most states, it's by county. You can go and vote in any of your county sites or township sites. And when you cast your ballot, unlike Connecticut, in most places, you actually get a ballot and actually put it into the scanner. So the scanner's ready. So as soon as the polls close on election night, they can hit the tabulation button and report those results out very quickly. Those results are among the very first that are reported out. Connecticut is probably most similar to Pennsylvania in the sense that Connecticut voters, like Pennsylvania, basically do an in-person ballot that's put into an envelope, much like a mail or absentee ballot, which then gets reviewed and verified again. So that's fine and good for security, and then tabulated later once the voter has left. Both work just fine. It's just a slightly different process, but it's very common with what we've seen in other states. Again, we often see election policy described as a highly partisan endeavor. And we see this now as we get close to the election with lawsuits that are being filed by Democrats and Republicans. But early in-person voting is something that 97% of voters get to do in the United States. This is something that is not partisan at all. It is something that is accepted by states that are incredibly deeply red, incredibly deeply blue. And that's because it just works for voters and it improves election security.
Well, and the fact that 97%, that's very high up there. And when we're talking about elections, I think one of the things that people are looking out for is voter turnout. So when states are allowing early voting, how does this impact voter turnout?
Voter turnout is a very complex thing affected by a lot of different factors. If voter turnout was affected only by how easy it was to vote, we wouldn't have expected to see the highest turnout in American history in the middle of a global pandemic when it was hard to vote. So there are a lot of factors that apply here, but it certainly doesn't hurt. We know that. And we are seeing pretty large numbers of people voting early. Now, they might have still voted on election day if that was the only option available to them. But we have already seen in the nation 8 million ballots cast, over 8 million ballots cast as we sit here talking right now.
Wow.
In Georgia, in just 2 days, they've seen over 600,000 early in-person ballots cast. That doesn't count mail ballots that are coming in. And in fact, in Connecticut, there have already been over 18,000 mail ballots returned. So this is something that's happening even with mail ballots requiring an excuse in Connecticut, which is something that may be changed in the future. There's still been 18,000 ballots returned in Connecticut so far. So we're seeing this is a trend nationwide. I don't know that it necessarily means higher turnout just by itself. There's so many other factors, but certainly campaigns will tell you, both Republicans and Democrats alike, that, and you heard Secretary Thomas mention this from when she talked to the candidate, campaigns love it when voters go and turn out early. Not only do they see a reduction in the amount of campaign-related mail and texting and calls and everything else that they get, but that's one fewer door that a campaign has to knock on. That's one fewer call that they have to make. And so campaigns will tell you they want to bank as many votes ahead of time. So whoever you're voting for, their campaign will appreciate it if you go and vote early.
Well, I, for one, would really appreciate one less text message in my inbox. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, and Secretary Thomas as well, but we did receive a question from a listener, Jill from Colchester, who shared with us that she voted a couple months ago during the primary, and she put her ballot in an envelope, which she sealed and then put into the voting machine. But the envelope had my name on it, and I was a little concerned about whether early votes are truly anonymous. So both of you touched on security a bit, but David, if you can answer Jill's question and may emphasize on what we were talking about security earlier as well.
Yeah, sure. That's handled exactly like a mail ballot, and the anonymity of that ballot is protected. The secrecy of that ballot is protected. The information that's placed on the outside of the envelope is there to confirm identity, just to confirm that the person who was supposed to cast the ballot did cast it. And that is verified in every single jurisdiction in the country. It's one of the reasons we know mail voting and early in-person voting is as secure as election day voting, despite some of the lies that have been spread about those methods of voting. And once that's reviewed, that envelope is open and the ballot is separated from the envelope and never placed together again. So when that ballot goes into a scanner or a tabulator to be tabulated, there is no connection to the envelope. It is completely separated, and there's no way to tie that ballot to the person who cast it. So secrecy is protected.
So got another question here before we go to break, but there's something that's also been at the forefront of our minds is accessibility, but in a way that the nation has seen back-to-back hurricanes in recent weeks, which is impacting voter accessibility for many people. How are you hearing election workers prepare for this on election day and throughout their early voting timeframe?
Well, this is another way that early voting and mail voting is really important as an option. We've seen, particularly in the Southeast, hurricanes affect people's lives, putting aside voting. I mean, there are people who are dealing with their homes being flooded, their possessions being ruined, roads being inaccessible, having difficulty with food and water and cell service and other essential things. And then election officials who are dealing with that are also preparing for an election date that cannot be moved. They're going to do this. And what we're seeing, for instance, in a place like North Carolina, which is starting early voting today, right now, as we're speaking, in the 13 affected counties, there were 80 early voting sites that were planned for opening before Helene hit. 75 of them are going to open on time. That's incredible. A real testament to the election workers. And every single county is going to have early voting sites. So there's only a small number that were no longer accessible, but every voter in that area is going to have access to early voting sites. And we've seen this happen before, and particularly for those in the Northeast, they might remember Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which was a real challenge for election officials. It wasn't quite as severe, probably, as certainly what we saw recently with Milton and Helene, but that hit about a week before Election Day with less time to recover and mitigate those effects. And again, we saw election officials, particularly, I think New Jersey and New York were hardest hit, but undoubtedly Connecticut saw some effects as well, that responded incredibly well and were resilient in the face of that. So I think people should be concerned and be really respectful and thoughtful about what voters and election officials are going on down there. But I'm actually relatively confident, having spoken to election officials in the affected areas, that they've got this, that they're doing what they've always done, which is regardless of whether it's a hurricane that hits them or a global pandemic that hits them or massive disinformation, they're getting the job done and facilitating the active democracy where we all get to have a voice in who leads us.
You've been listening to David Becker, who's the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and he'll be staying with us. Coming up, we'll hear from two poll workers helping to manage the polls in our state, and we want to hear from you. Let us know if you have a question about early voting. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. For poll workers, Election Day can be a long day. Early voting means even more work, but our next guests say that being a poll worker can be an incredibly meaningful experience, even when early voting adds 15 more days on top of a long election day here in Connecticut. Joining us now is David Fenn and Stacey Chowanec. David is a poll worker in Windham, and Stacey is a poll worker in Willimantic. Thank you so much, David and Stacey, for joining us today.
Sure.
Thanks for having us.
And also still with us is David Becker, who's the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. So, David Fenn, I want to start with you. Before we talk about more details about early voting in our state, I want to hear your story. What attracted you to become a poll worker in the first place?
Well, honestly, almost 15 or 20 years ago, I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, a friend of mine, or a friend of our family, was the registrar of voters, and she was having a really difficult time recruiting people. And she asked if I would be interested in helping. And I said, okay, what do you have to do? And so I started just as, the person who hands out the stickers at the end of the night. Not that that's any less of her job than any of the other ones, but eventually she basically forced me to go and train as a moderator so that she would have more people that could actually open and close the polls during the election. So it was basically a friend who knew that I have a difficult time saying no to people.
Well, hey, handing out the stickers is a very important job.
It's everyone's favorite part, I think.
I mean, I must admit, it's one of my favorite parts too. So, and
now with the stickers that we have, but we in our town anyway, there's a sticker contest that kids at the elementary schools are designing stickers for the vote. So we have two local kids who have designed our stickers, and we hand them out, and that's kind of a neat way to integrate the community as well.
We'll talk about civic engagement. That's a really fun way to get younger people to be involved. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier. I myself did not really understand how the whole thing worked until I was an early reporter. So it's really fun to hear how young people are getting engaged in this. And Stacey, what's your story?
The stickers actually go to grade 12.
And want to talk about your story, how you got into it, Stacey?
My story, actually, I had asked David Fenn, who was working in Windham Center, and I had just gone in to vote, and I was thinking I wanted to be part of the voting community, poll workers, and he told me that all I had to do was call the town hall and ask them. And so I did. I called, and Bunny put me right to work. And I started as a checker, and then they put me in as an assistant registrar, and then I became a moderator. And I absolutely love it. I think it's the best job ever, being part of that.
Sort of community.
Yeah, just being part of the everything, just working and having people say thank you, for being here. That is so rewarding. I love it, and it makes me feel so good.
Did you ever think you were going to be involved in something like this?
Not at all. No, never. It just, because I didn't think, I don't know. I didn't think I could for whatever reason. And I just thought there
I
was
think also for
Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I think for a lot of people, all of a sudden becoming civically involved is kind of transformative. Especially, I would say anyone who is, thinks that it's easy to manufacture votes or pull votes out of thin air or something like this. Volunteer at the polls. It is not an easy process to infiltrate in any kind of way. Especially in Connecticut, we have paper ballots. Every vote is accounted for by those ballots. So it is not it's not something that you can corrupt very easily. You'd have to take a lot of effort for it, and I think that
Absolutely
transforms people's thinking about also trust in government, trust in the process itself.
And so I feel like with many things, there's always so much more behind the scenes than you ever would anticipate. So David, can you share with us, what does an election day typically look like for you?
Well, election day starts very early. I mean, I'm up usually around 4 o'clock, and we have to be at the polls by 5:15 to open them up so that all of the stations are ready for 6 a.m. when the polls do officially open. And then you're basically in this room, all day for 15 hours until about 9 o'clock when the polls close. And, on an election day where it's a national election, it's actually, the time goes by fairly quickly because there's a lot happening all the time. But when you're doing a referendum on the third budget, 15 people come in. It could be a very long day of just being there with your friends.
Well, and Stacey, with that, you have this shared experience. Do you have any specific tasks that you do on election day, or does it vary, I imagine?
Well, I'm being the moderator. My task is, everything. So I might be helping out with the assistant registrars. I might be helping out with anybody in line who doesn't understand what's on the ballot even. It just depends on whatever's going on. And there is a lot happening sometimes. And being that we are in a community where it's mostly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking community, it's hard because they might not understand. So we rely heavily on the people that do speak Spanish. And so, they might be asked to go and speak to some of our other folks that do. And it can be really hard sometimes because you want to be able to help them,
right?
And you don't know how, and it's like,
right. You want to do more. And Stacey and David, both of you, as you mentioned, you've done this for quite a few years, and both of you also worked during the 2016 and the 2020 elections, and now, of course, you're working this upcoming elections. Can you talk about what were those elections like? No, Stacey, let's start with you first.
During COVID, that was the hardest, with making sure that all of the stations were cleaned properly, being hyper aware of making sure that we didn't have too many people in the building at the same time. I think that was the hardest election to work for me anyway. There was one election for the presidential election, it seemed like I was getting a lot of kids from Eastern showing up to help. And I thought that Kimberly was sending them to work for me. So I was giving them the oath. I was signing them in.
You mean college students from Eastern
Yes,
State?
to work. Yes.
Nice.
And I was giving them jobs, and it was really a lot of fun because it seemed like we were all working together, and these kids were so happy to be part of that process as well. And so, we were just teaching them how to do our jobs.
And David, what were your experiences like? Anything that jumped out to you during the 2016 and the 2020 election cycle?
Well, the last the Clinton-Trump campaign was really active. Let's just say that. And there are a lot of people that don't really understand that you are not supposed to enter into the polling place with banners or signs or any kind of declaration for a specific candidate, and getting people to take hats off or maybe to cover up their shirts coming into the polling place. That sometimes people would push back on that, but eventually, they realize it's really supposed to be nonpartisan. If you can, explain that to someone, they generally are okay with it, but it was very active. I did want to say something quick though about the early voting as opposed to election day voting, unless you. But what I'd like to say is it's quite different than election day voting in a couple of different ways, because essentially, as I think Mr. Becker pointed out, in Connecticut, you're basically filling out an absentee form in the presence of others. And then when you have finished with that absentee ballot, you put it into an envelope, and then that envelope goes into a secure green bag. And then on election day, all of those envelopes are opened and processed. The only issue with that, in my mind, is that if you have a complicated ballot, which occasionally we do, this year it's not too bad, I took a look at it, but if you're voting for a local race and there are 2 people you can vote for out of 5 candidates, or 3 people you can vote for, and you overvote, at that moment, there's no mechanism in place for people to know that they have made their ballot is in error. So it doesn't spit it back out right then. When you're in person on election day, if the ballot comes back, there's a little code on it, and it says, you have overvoted in this race. So if people are making errors on their early voting ballot, at this point, they could be disenfranchised if they make an error, because there's no way to catch that exactly. And I would say on election day, especially when you have a complicated ballot or there's 2 sides to a ballot or something like this, there are a lot of ballots that come back. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but enough to swing an election one way or another in these small town elections for sure. Well, so I think we need to address that.
And David Becker, would love for you to answer that if you can. And, with what we just heard about potential errors from happening, like what David described, are there solutions to this yet, or what are you seeing?
So as I mentioned, and David is quite right, what I mentioned is in the vast majority of places where early voting occurs, the ballot is verified when you check in, just like when you check in on election day. You get the ballot, you fill it out, and then you place it in the scanner yourself. And scanners in every place in the United States are programmed to reject ballots that have been overvoted. That's under federal law and federal elections. So if you did vote in the circumstance David just indicated, where you voted for 3 candidates when maybe you only should have voted for 2, or you voted for 2 when you only should have voted for 1, that ballot will be rejected. You'll get a chance to look at it. You'll get a chance to what's called spoil that ballot, which means that ballot goes into a special place and is not counted or tabulated, but we keep it there so we know it, so that we can count all the ballots up to make sure the counts match. And then you would get a new replacement ballot to cast to make sure you could cast that. When you vote by mail, or when you vote in the way early in-person voting is done in Connecticut or, for instance, Pennsylvania, that opportunity to correct potential problems like overvotes doesn't occur. So that might be something in Connecticut's future. But we also should note, this is the very first time Connecticut is doing early voting. It is okay to have an evolution of this. And Connecticut is experiencing that evolution right now. There are more options. There's more security around this. that's a very good thing. And in the future, I expect that Connecticut will join the majority of states, not just in New England, but nationwide, that offer early in-person voting where the ballot's actually entered into the scanner, mail voting without an excuse. I think those are probably coming to Connecticut in the future. And if I can just say one other thing, Catherine, really quickly, people like David and Stacey are the reason I do the job that I do. I've been doing this for over 25 years. I've been working, I used to be a Justice Department lawyer. I've worked with nonprofits. I work with my current nonprofit, the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And I don't know that people realize how much we rely upon the hundreds of thousands of professional election workers and the millions of volunteers who take time to be trained, who take time to come in early, well before the polls open, who stay well after the polls close, who come back year after year after year and recruit their friends and family and neighbors to do the same thing, all to ensure we get our voice. They don't do it for the money. They don't do it because they're going to get on a radio show. They rarely do. They do it because I think, as you heard from both Stacey and David, it's a calling. They feel like it's really important to them. I have a teenage son. He's not quite yet old enough to vote, but he's volunteering in the polls for the first time this year, and I'm incredibly proud of him for that. And if anyone has any doubts about the integrity of our system, about how hard it is to commit fraud and how extremely rare it is, David mentioned this as well, the best way to resolve those and learn what's happening, volunteer to be a poll worker. You will learn all the checks and balances, the redundancies, the transparencies that go into this process that make it almost impossible for voter fraud to occur on any kind of scale that could affect an election.
Well, before we go to break, I want to just have Stacey share some final thoughts because you've been nodding and smiling this entire time. What do you hope our listeners take away from this conversation today?
I just totally agree with that. Voter fraud is just, to me, it's just crazy. I just don't think it's possible. And whenever I hear that from anyone, it blows my mind to think that anyone would think that could happen. It can't.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. You've been listening to Stacey Chowanec, who's a poll worker in Willimantic. Thank you, Stacey, for being with us today. And also David Fenn, who's with us as a poll worker in Windham. Thank you, David, for sharing your story with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Also want to thank David Becker, who's the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, for being on with us today. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks, Catherine.
And tell your son, good luck. Coming up next, it's not too late to register to vote. The deadline is tomorrow, and we hear from one organization working to get out the vote. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There are more than 100,000 Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI, eligible voters here in Connecticut. That's according to the APIA Vote, a nonpartisan nonprofit empowering the AAPI community to vote. And joining us now is Ginny Kim. She's a volunteer with Asian Pacific American Coalition of Connecticut and also the co-lead of the Let's Vote initiative. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ginny.
Thanks for having me, Catherine. Excited to be here.
Well, we're excited that you're here as well. And talk about the Asian Pacific American Coalition of Connecticut recently received a Get Out to Vote grant, or Get Out the Vote grant. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, would love to. So the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving provides a annual Get Out the Vote grant to a number of community-based organizations. This was the first year that any Asian-focused organization had applied for a grant. We were fortunate to receive it. And based on the statistics that you just mentioned, Catherine, so a little over 100,000 eligible API voters. And based on some data we have, about 55% voter registration of those, which is lower than some other groups. So our focus was on really increasing civic engagement, voter registration amongst the AAPI communities in Connecticut.
And so there's a lot of community engagement events, I think, as part of this, where you're out and about in the community, helping people get registered or really helping them understand how the process works. What did you learn from that experience? Did you get a sense of, why the voter turnout is so historically low?
Yeah, we learned a lot. And first of all, we had a lot of fun too. I mean, I have to say that it was so empowering and engaging to be there. A couple of lessons that we learned. First is that relationships matter. So, being part of a community that is reaching out within itself to explain why voting is so important, showing up at some picnics, having some folks register, and then walking around and go tell their friends to come and register too was really impactful. And that was really empowering to see. One of the things that we realized is it's really not that hard to convince people to vote or to register to vote. It was more a matter of just meeting them where they were and saying, hey, we're here. We'd love you to register. And people were really excited to do that. We saw parents register and then tell their kids, their college-age kids, to go register. And then we actually saw it the other way around. So kids register and then they say, I got to make sure my parents are registered too. So the community relationships really matter when it comes to building this culture of civic engagement. And we found that as we entered many, many diverse ethnic groups, because, the Asian American community is really diverse.
Right.
And so we can't really talk about one big polyglot. But as we went to different picnics and different events of these different groups, what we found also is that there are already a lot of people who are incredibly engaged, have been longstanding voters, and we're really trying to nurture those crystals of engagement and build it into a greater movement. One thing that we did learn, and this is not going to be a surprise for anyone who knows immigrant groups, but like other groups that have a large number of immigrant populations, one of the things is that it's a matter of education. So, some people who are foreign born but now citizens may have come from countries that don't have a long-standing democratic tradition, who may not have experienced the empowerment of a really free and fair democracy. And so part of this is just really an education and telling people about, that elections in this country are free and fair, as we've heard from the other speakers, that your vote really does matter, and that fundamentally democracy only works if people understand how democracy works. And so that's what we've been trying to do.
We got about a minute and a half left, but what's next after getting people registered? And can you remind listeners what the deadline to register to vote is?
Absolutely. I would love to remind people that the deadline to register is tomorrow, October 18th. And that's not the end of the story, though. As Secretary of State Thomas said, you can always go and do same-day voting. And please consider that if you haven't yet registered to vote, go in person to any of the early voting days or on election day. What's next for us is we're going to continue the momentum we've built and really focus on next year's election, because some people stop voting after the presidential election, but we really want people to vote for their local government as well.
Well, we appreciate your work, Ginny Kim. Thank you so much for being with us today. Ginny is the volunteer with Asian Pacific American Coalition of Connecticut and also co-lead of the Let's Vote initiative. Ginny, appreciate you and your time today.
Thanks for having this topic, Catherine. It's really important.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all for listening.